Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Steve Anderson, and I serve as Dean of the UIUC School of Social Work. Thanks so much for joining us for our second presentation this semester in our lecture series on harnessing technology for the social good. This series was created to provide innovative research and technology applications to more impactfully reach highly vulnerable groups who face some of the most vexing social problems in our society. Today, I'm very happy to welcome Professor Christina Fominaya, who is Professor of Global Studies at Aarhus University, all the way from Denmark. Professor Fominaya is a noted expert on social movements and protest, and on the use of the internet and other digital tools to promote democracy and progress for marginalized groups. She's published extensively in these areas, including the recent books Democracy Reloaded, Inside Spain's Political Laboratory from 15M to Podemos, Social Movements in a Globalized World, second edition, and the Routledge Handbook of Contemporary European Social Movements, Protest in Turbulent Times. In addition, she serves as editor-in-chief of the journal Social Movement Studies and is co-founder of the Open Access Social Movements Journal Interface. Her talk today is entitled Digitally Enabled Democracy: Challenges and Opportunities for Harnessing the Power of the Digital for Progressive Social Change and a Deeper Democracy. Professor Fominaya will provide some conceptual tools and examples to help activists think through the use of digital tools and the internet. She'll first discuss some of the key divides encountered in the digital sphere. She will then discuss challenges faced by activists trying to harness the power of the digital for progressive change, before providing some powerful examples of good practice and innovation. Professor Fominaya, I'll turn it over to you now. Thank you so much for coming to join us.
Thanks so much for the invitation, and good afternoon, and thanks to everybody who has come. And thanks for the lovely introduction. Today, I want to offer you some insights on some of the key challenges and opportunities. We're going to talk more about challenges than opportunities because I only have a certain amount of time. Facing activists hoping to harness the power of the digital sphere for progressive change. And first, I want to have a look at some of the challenges, and many of these can be understood as falling into a series of what we could call digital divides. And our classic understanding of digital divides has always been the difference between people who actually have access to the internet and people who do not have access to the internet. But I'm actually going to be talking about the divides that we encounter online in the virtual sphere. And understanding the source of these divides, not the source, but understanding the nature of these divides can really help us be reflexive about the choices and protocols that we develop for our online organizing practices. And we start from the realization that the digital sphere, like all social worlds, is shot through by relations of power. And this means forms of domination, oppression, marginalization, and silencing, as well as resistance, empowerment, progressive collective action, and giving voice. Now, problematic power relations traverse all aspects of digital activism, and we need to be aware of that if our goal is creating a deeper democracy or a more socially just world, however we want to define those terms. And there's some widespread assumptions about the digital sphere that can hinder our aspirations for a more democratic and just world. The first is a tendency to assume that the internet is somehow inherently democratic. The other is to assume that it's somehow neutral and autonomous. And both of these assumptions are wrong. The internet is neither inherently democratic and participatory, nor is it neutral and autonomous. In other words, we can't simply leave the internet to its own devices. Sorry about that. I'm just going to find where I can. There we go. We can't just leave the internet to its own devices and assume that it's going to be a force for progressive participation. And we also can't think of that it's not a space that's shaped by historical, social, political, and cultural forces. So where and how does power shape the virtual sphere? The first arena that I want to talk about is actually the state, and the way that state power can penetrate the virtual sphere. And this includes issues like state surveillance, the right to privacy and net neutrality, which is a big issue in the US context. Now, according to the campaign Battle for the Net, net neutrality is the principle that everyone should have access to websites and apps, preventing internet providers like Comcast and Verizon from creating fast lanes, from censoring content, from throttling traffic, and even outright blocking access to their competitors' products. And the implications of not having net neutrality are that it gives internet providers the power to decide whether or not we can get online and under what conditions. And so according to the Battle for the Net, some of the implications of this are really important to think about. So when the Trump administration repealed net neutrality in 2016, Verizon throttled traffic when California firefighters were trying to fight wildfires, which put people in danger. Internet service providers have decided to leave poor rural and communities of color behind by cutting them out of broadband expansion. And as the COVID pandemic came along, people were at the mercy of internet companies to get online, to go to work, to go to school, and to access life-saving information. So access to the internet in this day and age is absolutely crucial. Now, the Biden administration reinstated the principles of net neutrality in 2021, but the battle for net neutrality is probably going to be ongoing because there's always going to be a pressure to once again put that power in the hands of the providers. But it serves as a powerful example of how state and economic interests can radically shape participation online. Research has also shown us how some states influence citizens' views on the political use of the internet, which also shapes online participation. So in repressive regimes like Turkey or Russia, authoritarian governments don't just restrict internet freedoms, particularly to political content, but they also establish psychological firewalls that paint the internet as a scary place that's full of political threats. And this increases threat perceptions among the public, which in turn increases the public's support for online political censorship. And this is research by Stoichev and Nisbet from 2016. And what they say is that as a result, at least 1/3 of Turkish internet users are afraid to openly discuss politics online. And in Russia in 2015, they had a survey by the Pew Global Attitudes Project, and 2/3 of Russians preferred a strong autocratic leader to a democratic system. Thus, this autocratic rather than democratic political culture among the Russian public is reflected in their attitudes about internet governance as well. So these examples highlight that the legal and regulatory context shape the conditions under which mobilization and collective action and dissent emerge and evolve. So the fight for internet freedoms and access are important for activists working on any issue because this context affects what you can say and do online. And it also determines the legal consequences of speaking out or mobilizing. And this is those consequences can be really drastic, and that is by no means limited to authoritarian countries, I should say. This kind of legal consequences for speaking out is very widespread in democratic countries as well. And it's very, very problematic for activism. So just getting back to this idea of, why we should be thinking about these contexts with regard specifically to the role of the internet and its link to mobilization and its link to democratization, these examples show that, as Stoichev and Nisbet argue, that we need to dispense once and for all with the "if they build it, they will come" kind of philosophy that underlies a lot of internet freedom promotion, and that doesn't take into account human psychology and how people think about participation online, in which, for example, entertainment choices are preferred over news, and attitudes towards the internet determine its use as much as technology determines its use. In fact, much more than technology itself. Some more implications of this larger idea for digital activism is that things like internet penetration rates or even internet freedoms are insufficient for the internet to be used as an effective tool for pro-democracy mobilization. And instead, we need to consider political cultures that are tied to internet use. And here, the role of the state can be really important in structuring the context that can foster or hinder the development of a thriving online participatory sphere. A second key area in which the digital sphere is shot through with unequal power relations is gender. And research clearly shows us that women cannot access the digital sphere in equality of conditions to men. Cyberbullying, cyber violence, marginalization, silencing, and ignoring are strongly gendered, with women being the targets and victims of these behaviors overwhelmingly. Now, the interesting thing here is that not only does this mirror the reality offline, but in many cases, the virtual sphere magnifies this, even in activist spaces that are firmly committed to feminism, horizontalism, and inclusivity. And I want to give you just a brief example from my research. Several years ago, I was participating in and researching a global justice group in Europe that was radically committed to horizontality and democracy and participatory democracy. They met every week in the assembly face to face, and they also used an email list to communicate between people, between meetings, and also to help supposedly keep people in the loop who were not able to get to all the meetings, right? They might not live locally. Now, according to the protocols of this group, the assembly itself was the sovereign space. That's where the decision-making of the arena was. And what I noticed through participation was something very curious, especially in a group that was committed to non-hierarchical participation. And that was that email exchanges not only reproduced, but magnified power imbalances within the face-to-face assembly. And that this happened in a really gendered way. Not only did men post much, much longer and much, much more emails, but they also felt entitled and authorized to take unilateral decisions via email that went over the group's protocols, which stated that the decisions had to be taken inside the assembly. And when I interviewed group members, I explored why some group members were not participating in these email exchanges and how they felt about them. And what I found was that far from being a neutral space for exchange, the email list was very much shaped by gendered patterns of social interaction, where women were much less likely to participate and more likely to feel alienated from the email discussion as a participatory space. Now, exclusions didn't only happen on gendered lines. Research on computer-mediated communication in the global justice movement has shown that even in participatory networks and forums, so these movements want to be participatory, right? A few people tend to dominate the discussion, and people tend to reply and respond to people they know, but not to people they don't know. So this leads us to an important realization. If our vision for democracy includes freedom and equality of participation for all, and if we see the internet as a neutral, autonomous playing field of equal opportunity, then we're simply just going to give people access to that space and adopt a laissez-faire approach. Or we might have some basic protocols that say, no flaming or no hate speech or something like that. But what we need to realize that our use of ICTs and digital media reflect cultural patterns in the wider society, such as gender inequality and sexism. And while it's easy for us to recognize really obvious and glaring examples of sexism online, so, rape threats against women who make a feminist statement or something along those lines, or threats of violence and so on, it's much harder for us to see the more subtle forms of male dominance online, which can actually have a significant effect on inhibiting participation, even in groups that are committed to equality. So even though in theory it's open space for everybody, in practice, we have power relations and we have cultural patterns that shape that participation in really significant ways. And I think it's interesting to go beyond the activist spaces themselves out to the communities that paradoxically provide us with the greatest opportunity for harnessing the power of the digital for progressive social change, which are the civic tech and open source communities. And Vivian Maideborn has written a really excellent article on the sexism prevalent in that community as part of her work with Lumio. She went on a tour in 2014, and she was with her colleague Ben, and they were touring Europe, and they were meeting activists who were interested in citizenship and direct democracy and open tech and so on. And what she wrote in her journal is really kind of illuminating, and her reflexivity as somebody who is a member of that community and how she was perceiving that tour. And she said this: what has been shocking is how few women have been part of this journey, how much men have dominated the space across countries and cultures. My senses feel assaulted with this assertion of masculine presence in so many ways. The men who hear me ask a question but address their responses to Ben, the woman-hating art on the office walls of men with whom we thought we shared a vision for the future, the men who interrupt women's conversations to assert their knowledge and expertise, closing down the sharing already in play, the taking of physical space in buses and trains. In Strasbourg, even the youth delegation in our session, as wonderful as they were all men. I wonder if hearing and listening to the issues of youth is just one more priority that is more important than addressing the inequality of women and the silencing of women's voices. So what she points out is that not only are women woefully underrepresented in tech, engineering, and coding, but they're also silenced within the tech community through the privileging of male voices and the value that's placed on male-dominated roles. And her article provides links to a wealth of critiques of the sexism within open source communities, but also to some very positive and transformative initiatives from within those communities that are actively trying to eradicate sexism and build a feminist alternative. So the point here is that reflexivity about power then inside and within, outside and within digital activist communities is also crucial for us to think about. But of course, we can also talk about the racist virtual. And as Eugenia Ciapera writes, quote, there's a large body of research that has identified online racist hate speech, focusing on those who develop and share racist hate, on the specific targets and on the various internet and or digital genres that host such hateful speech. Taken together, these aspects form a very bleak picture of a digital environment that is not only racialized in the sense that it is becoming inimical to and marginalizes or ghettoizes non-white, non-Western people, but which also actively robs these people from participating in the construction of a common digital future. And there's several ways that the online environment facilitates a resurgence of open racism without any social consequences. And Rob Eshman has published research on how the online arena has resulted in what he calls the unmasking of racism. And what he says is that following the civil rights movement, a lot of people in the United States context, especially those who weren't subject to racism directly, felt that while racism hadn't disappeared by any means, it tended to be more subtle. It wasn't as open, it wasn't as ugly as it was before the civil rights movement. But what his research on racist online spaces on a university campus showed is that the kind of open and ugly racist attitudes that many people in the US thought were a thing of the past are in fact given full reign online, because anonymity in those spaces means that there aren't any social consequences at all for being openly racist. Now, some of the ways that becoming aware of those racist comments online affected students of color is the subject of his research. And one group of activist students that he analyzed felt disempowered because of the technology that was protecting the identity of their racist peers, because it also meant that they didn't have a clear opponent. Because of anonymity, they didn't know who those racist peers were. So they felt very disempowered by that. And that affected other students as well, because some of them became less trustful of their white peers because they were aware that any one of them could have been posting on that online website. Now, this was a website that was embedded in a particular university community, but it speaks to the larger issues of the impact that online dynamics can have on discrimination and marginalization, but also crucially on participation. And what Eshman says is, and I quote, "From cell phone footage of police killing unarmed Blacks to leaked racist emails and messages, or even tweets from President Trump that frequently blur the line between covert and overt racism, internet-based communication is exposing the continuing significance of racism in a world that sometimes pretends to be colorblind." Now, in both cases, online racism, online sexism, while the reality is very ugly, it also, in a way, this research provides a really important counterweight to those who argue and continue to argue that racism and sexism are a thing of the past and we don't need to worry about it. So this research helps us make that case very, very clearly. I also wanted to just point out, I don't have time to go into this with you, but I really recommend an exercise on journalism and moderation of comments. I do this a lot with my students. It's called The Dark Side of Guardian Comments, and you can work through that whole link with your students, and it's a very illuminating and powerful experience, and it's a really great way to get debates going as well. So I just wanted to point that out to you. Now, there's a lot of other digital divides that we could talk about, which you're probably aware of: economic gaps, racial gaps, gender gaps, disability gaps, LGBTQ gaps. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the ones that you might not have thought about so much. And one of those is the question of technical expertise. Now, this divide can really result in the marginalization within activist groups of those members who don't have access to or the technological knowledge necessary to engage with digital tools. And if groups aren't reflexive about this, they can be unwittingly leaving people out. And as the number, I mean, a lot of young people are in activist groups for many obvious reasons. And as more digital natives with technical expertise are in these groups, the more important this aspect of reflexivity becomes. I've seen this a lot in Spain's 15M assemblies, where decision-making can quickly shift over, for example, into Telegram, which not everybody knows how to use, and it's not actually a very effective place to have any kind of deep discussion. Or, you know, participation might require having access to some kind of technology or navigating it in a way that some activists, usually older activists, don't have. And that can really have a negative impact on activist participation and the feeling of cohesion in the groups. And it also, though, I want to raise another issue related to this, which is that technological expertise divide, or this lack of understanding, can also really hamper attempts to overcome the reliance on corporate social media and tools, which many activists find problematic for very good reasons. And if we just take the example of Linux, for example, I remember very clearly one of my interviewees telling me a story about receiving a really patronizing and condescending email that was chastising her for using corporate software and not using Linux. And she said, yeah, sure, come on over, install it on my computer, teach me how to use it, and I'll happily give up my corporate software. I don't want to be using this either. So Tereva then recently said this about Linux. She said, Linux powers anything from toasters to supercomputers, but it hasn't liberated the masses from Windows or Mac OS. For too long, the installation and use of a Linux distribution was too hard for ordinary users. Superior technology, if polished only to the point where it is good enough for hackers and early adopters, will not escape that ghetto. So a challenge for activist communities is, and specifically for the communities producing these tools, is that they need to be way more proactive in developing user-friendly tools or training people how to use them if they want their use to spread beyond hacktivist ghettos. Which brings me to another aspect of this divide, and another divide online, which is that differences in technical knowledge and ability affect our use of digital media, but so does culture. And my own research on digital media use in activist communities shows that different networks have different digital repertoires. Activists in Spain, for example, used to use Titan pads as a key organizing tool. Titan pads are also called ether pads. They're a way of collaborative creating collaborative documents that are connected to each other with hyperlinks. But in Ireland, nobody used them. So Irish activists were just as digitally savvy as Spanish ones. They just didn't use Titan pads. It didn't form part of their repertoire. So other research has found that it's really difficult to get people to actually adopt new technologies and new participatory online tools. So they design something that's really great, but it's very, very hard to get people to actually start using them if using them is not part of their everyday life. So it's not just about designing a great tool, it's about thinking about ways to get these tools put to use. And because of changing technology and constant updates, like TitanPad, for example, no longer exists because they didn't have the resources to keep the code updated and maintained and upgrading. So it's just gone out of use, which means that this was a non-corporate solution and a really key organizing tool that basically disappeared, as well as all that time and all that cultural know-how that was invested in the use of those tools as well. Another problem is the hacktivist ghetto produces its own distortions as well. One, which I'm sure you've heard of, is the echo chamber effect, which is basically that you participate in online spaces where your own opinions are constantly reflected back to you, which just reinforces your individual belief system because you're not being exposed to a range of other people's opinions. But this can also affect activists' awareness of and evaluation of who they're reaching and with what effect. And too often activists assume that because they've published something online or posted something online, that they have effectively communicated their message. But if you just get on Twitter and try to follow the feed of an anonymous account, for example, if you're not a member of the anonymous community, or follow debates with any particular activist community that you don't actually belong to. If you're not an active member of that community, you probably will have no idea what people are talking about much of the time, because you lack the necessary referential and contextual information. And that doesn't even take into consideration how very limited Twitter is anyway in its reach and its audience. And that people tend to follow people they're already in agreement with and already in alignment with. So that's what they're going to see coming back at them on their Twitter and Facebook. So we can fall into a sort of self-delusion when we measure the success of our political communication by how many retweets or engagements or likes we're getting on Twitter or on Facebook. Not to mention the disjuncture between what's happening online and what's happening offline. So for example, I've seen calls to protest that become trending topics on Twitter, but if you actually go to the protest, there's hardly anybody there. So success or impact then needs to be considered in relation to the goals that the group has actually set for itself. If getting people on the street is what you were aiming for, then measure your success or your impact based on that. If raising awareness of the issue is what you were going for, then measure your impact based on that. But don't adopt a one-size-fits-all approach that's just based on numbers, because it doesn't actually make any sense. The final challenge that I want to address are the issues of audience and legitimacy in political communication. This is really, the digital revolution has just absolutely transformed political communication. And in the pre-internet world, activists could tailor their messages for different audiences, highlighting some things for those who were already on board, who were already members, or who were already sympathetic, stressing different arguments for a different audience that they were trying to persuade or convince. There was a clear front stage and a clear backstage. Today, it's really, really difficult to tailor messages for specific audiences. And this poses a real challenge for activism because, the message that appeals to your supporters might not be the one that you need to be giving to get new people on board with your issue or your program. And of course, we have the horrible issue of misinformation and disinformation. Manipulation of images is another challenge activists face. Circulation of false statistics, false attributions, photos that are supposedly from one demo, but are actually from a whole completely different demo. Activists who are erased out of photographs, so it looks like there were fewer people there. All of these problems stemming from within sympathetic and challenger communities mean that building up trust and legitimacy, which is crucial for political effectiveness, you must have trust and legitimacy from the community that supports you. It becomes extremely difficult, especially for small or resource poor organizations. So that brings us to the opportunities. And despite the many, many challenges that digital activists face, there are still, some really amazing opportunities out there. The ability to harness collective intelligence and resources for common goals is still the most remarkable aspect of the digital revolution, whether that means open source code, knowledge sharing, cooperative collaboration across time and space, networked action. And there is a wealth of practical online resources to facilitate effective organizing. And this is just a screen cap from the Amnesty International Commons Library Social Media Guide. It's a real mouthful. And I've included a bunch of other resources at the end of the PowerPoint. And you can see that this is very practical. It's like giving examples and giving practical advice to activists who are thinking about their political communication strategies online. So I want to start to close this talk by giving you an example, a case study example of powerful organizing, harnessing the power of the internet, which there's a whole chapter on this organization in my book, Democracy Reloaded. So most of you, I hope, will be aware of the Occupy movements and the pro-democracy movements that swept the globe following the financial crash of 2008. And one of the most exciting outcomes of that wave of protest was the cross-contamination of different activists, which brought together a cross-contamination and synergy between different strands and different traditions of organizing. And one of the most promising to me, one of the most exciting, has been the reciprocal influence of autonomous feminist and hacker ethics and praxis. And one example of this comes from one of my favorite groups in Spain's 15M movement, which is called 15M Parrato, or 15M Parrato. And I'll focus on the hacker ethic and how that influences their whole way that they think and the whole way that they mobilize. And they manage to harness digital tools in a very effective way. So 15 Parrato shows us that a very small group of people who are committed to doing something and who plan and do it really well can actually achieve an awful lot if they're supported by a wider movement community. So what do? 15M Parrato, very briefly. This is a small group of activists who coordinate an initiative that has managed to expose some of the most significant political and economic corruption scandals in Spain in the past years. And essentially, they started in the wake of the financial crisis. Spain, like many other countries, bailed out banks, private banks, with public money. And it later transpired that the banks that had been bailed out had engaged in fraud, but no one was bringing charges against those who were responsible for that. So in the absence of action from the state, a small group of people decided that they were going to do it on behalf of the Spanish people and with the help of the Spanish people. And Sergio, one of the founders, told me how they got started and how hacker ethics influenced their thinking from the very beginning. So this is the story he told me. Well, Simona comes along one day and she says to me, listen, I've got this idea. And she explained it to me. And I said, okay, let me see if I've got this straight. You're telling me that we're going to take on the president of the International Monetary Fund, the ex-vice president of the Spanish government, the ex-minister of the economy, one of the most powerful people in Spain whose family has been governing here for generations. It was complete madness. But what she explained to me seemed completely logical. And it fit within the political logic that we have, which is based on scalability and which draws on a hacker mentality and not on a leftist mentality. Because the leftist mentality says, what we need to do is do away with capitalism. Yes, but how do you actually do away with capitalism? You need a more specific target and you need a really robust plan, with each step paying for itself. So the logic is, what's the point of taking each of these steps? Well, the point is to take the next step. And whatever we end up achieving, it's going to be for the common good. So the group harnesses the power of the internet to get the most out of collective intelligence, networked resources, and a very detailed plan with an activist core to make it happen. Another member says to me, participant, we don't believe in membership. The thing is to have a really concrete objective and a very, very detailed plan, and certain people who take responsibility for making it happen, while at the same time opening it up to other collectives and other people to help out from time to time as needed. So this is an explicit contrast to the large assembly-based occupations of the squares. They are what is called a catalyst group. And a catalyst group is based on complementary specialized knowledge and mutual trust. And I'll just give you another quote to explain that. In 15M Parrato, we have people who are specialized in law, people who are specialized in communication, and they take the decisions or positions on what they are experts in. And others might comment, or they might add, or they might even have a different opinion, which might be discussed. But there's confidence that people are skilled and that they can work without having to go through assemblies and consensus constantly. So it makes decisions and progress much, much faster. But they also wouldn't be able to do this if they weren't able to harness the power of the movement community, because they don't have resources. It's just like 7 people. So they thought it was going to take them a year to get the evidence that they needed to bring Rodrigo Rato to trial. And so they launched a campaign on May 23rd, 2012, asking citizens to provide any evidence that would help to put him in jail using their secure X mailbox. And the X mailbox is a secure way for anyone with information about corruption to make it available to journalists, lawyers, activists, and auditors. They use a Tor network so that they can conceal whistleblowers' IP addresses. And only accredited journalists have access to the X mailbox, because in Spain, journalists are not obliged, they're protected by law to withhold informers' identities in court. So after the journalists who are accredited filter these messages, they draw up a fully anonymized report containing all the information that needs to be followed up on. And then they send that to a second mailbox that other XNet members can access. And essentially using this process, in 2 weeks, they were able to gather all the evidence that they needed to get the, to start the process going. And this initiative was widely reported in the media. And with this, another one of their key goals was also achieved, because really what they're about, yes, they want to see these people pay for what they've done, but their real motivation, the real political motivation of this group is actually to spread the idea that ordinary citizens can take action and that they can use existing institutions to bring about change, even if those institutions are failing to regulate or carry out their duty to the citizens. So it's about reclaiming institutions for the citizens. So they used crowdfunding, which I'm sure you all know what that is. And by the June 4th, 2012, thanks to all the citizen input, the draft of the lawsuit was almost complete. Somebody needed to pay the lawyers, and they launched their crowdfunding. They got their money in 24 hours. They ran out of the original 15,000 euros in a few years. They did it again. They got more money. And they not only managed to bring charges against Rodrigo Rato, but they managed to transform people's understanding of what had happened in the crisis and the consequences. But they also uncovered corruption that went way beyond their initial target, which was Bankia and Rodrigo Rato. Through that X mailbox, somebody dumped 8,000 emails that showed collusion and corruption between economic and political elites in Spain. Essentially, it documented the existence of black or opaque credit cards that were being used to charge against savings banks without being reported to the Treasury. So they were evading taxation by 15.5 million. But not only that, what really was the detonator of the scandal part was that it uncovered 58 members of all the major political parties and unions in Spain at that time who had these black credit cards and who were basically corrupt. So according to 15M Parrato, the scandal revealed the complicity of corruption between the banks and the political elites and a collusion to loot Bankia in exchange for credits to parties and trade unions. And it made a huge stink. So how are they supported by the bigger community? Well, the 15M movement also really kickstarted and re-kickstarted, if you will, some previously existing critical independent media, which supported and publicized and reported and collaborated also as journalists on what 15M Parrato was doing. And they made sure that the news was just too big for mass media to ignore. It got, so that it would actually get out there. They also built up trust and legitimacy within activist networks through their responsible behavior as whistleblowers. So they're very, very careful to do everything exactly as it needs to be done. And throughout, they really had this slogan, "The citizens did it," because as I said, that was their key motivation. But that was also the biggest challenge for them, according to Sergio. And it really ran up against the media conventions that want to attribute action to established institutions or individuals. So this is what he said. He said, if we manage to make it so that Rato goes to jail, but the message that people get is that this was something that was just done by politicians, in that sense, we will have failed, because what we want is for people to know that unless the people do it, no one's going to do it. And what's more, we want them to know that it can be done. So this is the most difficult stumbling block that we've come across. What I want is for citizens to be able to have a comprehensive understanding of our recent history and what actually happened with this crisis. I want them to know that collectively we can work together and that by using the web, we can publish useful information that will help people understand. They were successful also because they were very creative. They wrote a play, they took it on the road, they crowdfunded it. That poster says, "Become a banker." It's the name of the play, "Become a Banker." But as I said before, they wouldn't have been able to do all this without that wider movement community supporting them when they needed support. So I guess that's the key takeaway message that I have, which is that people often ask, well, how can we have a strong movement? And it's not really about the tools. I mean, the tools are incredibly useful. They're incredibly important. They help enormously, but it's about having clarity of vision. It's about political commitment. It's about solidarity. It's about sharing goals. Those things are so much more important than technology per se. If you have technology and you don't have that, you don't have a strong movement. So very, very finally, because I know that I've probably gone on far too long, I just wanted to sort of throw some very final tips or about the use of communication tools and activist groups. First of all, have a talk, have a dedicated discussion about the tools you're using. Don't just use whatever you have to hand. Don't just carry on as normal. Stop and think about what you're actually doing. Have explicit protocols for the use of your tools. Make sure that whatever protocols you use not only serve organizational goals, but also serve member values, and that they actually work to sustain cohesion and organization over time in the face of challenges. Be consciously reflexive about the tools that you use. Ask yourselves, why do we use it? Why do we do things this way and not another way? What advantages or disadvantages does it have? Is there a better way to do this? So you need to review also your toolkit and protocols periodically. Don't think that just because it was working, it's going to be working forever. Keep being reflexive and reviewing. And be aware of the pitfalls of using particular tools and protocols. Think about your own praxis, but also do your research. There's loads of incredible research out there that can really provide practical help and information. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that some of all of that will be useful to you when we think about digital tools and the digital sphere, when we try to make a world a better place using those tools. And as I said, I have left in the slides some different resources and some references that you can access that hopefully will also be helpful to you. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Fominaya. Participants, please, if you have questions, you can ask because you can participate in this. And then you have a chat box, which I'm moderating. So please, your questions. It's a note from Martin. Thank you so much for this most useful guidance. Taking notes from your rich talk straight to my 1 p.m. community info minutes studio class. Thank you, Martin.
That's great.
I'm curious about you have a lot of different things to say that seem to be intertwined, and to me they point out the complexity of getting people together digitally. And first of all, you emphasize you have to have trust, so that's kind of a foundation. But even beyond that, what you say about culture being different in the networks that people use differ quite a bit by culture, and then the pragmatic side of the what technology people actually have access to. It seems to me like you almost have to have a team of people with expertise in those different areas if you even figure out a modestly coherent strategy to interact with people. Is that what you've seen in general, that you do have kind of specialization within groups of people when they are thinking about this?
Yeah, well, the way that it works in the networks that I'm most familiar with, like in the 15M network, especially in larger groups, is that you have a bunch of subgroups. And so people who have expertise in certain areas or who are just interested in learning about certain areas, it doesn't have to just be people who are experts, will get together in these subgroups to work on particular things. So there would be a communications group, and there'll be, an outreach group. And a lot of that stuff will happen with the whole group at the same time, but then they'll often split up into these smaller groups, or there might be a legal group who's just looking at the legal implications. Somebody else who's working on the web page or on the communication strategy. People who are working on the theater, part. I mean, there's just so many different groups that you can have. It depends on how many resources you have, of course, because and it also depends on the scope of what you're doing. So 15M Parrato had one goal, they had a very clear goal, and everything they did was designed to get them to that goal. All their protocols, all their strategies was to get those people in front of a judge and on trial. So that's different from a group who might be having a different objective or having a broader objective. But the key, though, is what you really don't want to do is not talk about it and not think about it. Even if you're not experts, even if you don't have, a huge amount of knowledge, that doesn't matter. That shouldn't stop anybody. I certainly hope that no one would have a takeaway from this of thinking you have to be an expert in technology to be an activist, because that's absolutely not the case. But it's about being reflexive about your methodology, and that extends beyond the digital. That is about everything that you do in your group and how you communicate, how you organize. And in 15M, the most successful groups would usually have a subgroup called DINA, or Dinamización, which is like a facilitator group. And they would meet before the meeting started, before the assembly actually took place. They would meet to design the protocols and the strategy and the methodology for the meeting to make sure that that meeting went well. So there was a pre-meeting to design the meeting to make sure the meeting went well. That's something that happens now, but didn't happen 20 years ago when I was also active in that same network. And the difference is really huge in terms of how effectively you can organize when you have good facilitators and a lot of reflexivity about what the problems are, you know, and how to navigate those. Yeah. Does anybody else have questions? I would love to hear people's comments as well. You don't have to have a question.
I have a question, especially about, we are now seeing more and more internet, censorship, especially in many countries. And given that, despite good intentions and good, leadership qualities, vision, how would you think that would affect the movements?
Well, we know from research that it affects movements by making people more risk averse and more cautious about what they say and do online, which is why fighting for our freedom to speak is, you know, and to freedom of assembly and freedom of expression. That's the first and most unifying goal we all should have. Because if that's gone, everything else, any other issue you want to do, it doesn't matter what issue it is going to be severely, severely hampered. And we're seeing, as a result of the Occupy movements, as an unintended and negative consequence of them, is an increase in criminalization of protest, of dissent. And as I say, that's by no means limited to authoritarian countries. That is widespread. Governments don't like being critiqued. Politicians don't like being critiqued. And and they're in charge of making the laws. I mean, we still have a gag law in Spain that hasn't been overturned, even though we have this progressive government in government. Why is that? You know, that law should have been overturned immediately when they came in, and it hasn't been. And it's very, very problematic. And it doesn't just criminalize protest or dissent or add a lot of cost to it. It also criminalizes solidarity. It also criminalizes poverty. And you've got that in the United States as well, where, you know, I don't know if it's Florida somewhere that it's illegal to feed the homeless. I mean, things like that. There are actually laws and ordinances that prevent you from being a human, you know, from being a good human being is illegal. That's just crazy. So those kind of fundamental things are something that everybody should be super, super concerned about and have it on the top of their list. And then everything else follows from there, I think.
We do have developing laws, by the way, that are state-based that do include not feeding people or giving them water while waiting to vote. So, I mean, there's a lot of unfortunate activity going on in these areas.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I know that we're at 1 o'clock and people have to